I don't think that there's any time too early to start that transition process, whether you're in your 30s or 40s or 50s. Uh, ASAP is a good time to kind of get started. We like to think about it as an estate plan, if you will. So many times clients are, they have an estate plan in place for what's going to happen should something happen to them. And so we like to think that you should think about your practice the same way. What happens if you weren't here tomorrow?
It's never too early. Sometimes, or most of the time, we get a call when they're a year away, and it's generally just not as much time as we would prefer. But if we get an early enough start, we have our most valuable resource is the Practice Optimizer experience, where we can start 5 to 7 years out and get into estate planning, establish a value for the practice, for the real estate, measure that up to a financial advisor, work our way backwards to a date, get everything in check with the AR and with the insurance, and be really prepared for an exit. And that way, even if something that you didn't plan happened, your spouse doesn't have to start from scratch. Depends on how early you start. So if you start early enough, it all gets down to estate planning. But if it's just before, you're ready to exit, you want to make sure that you've got your accounts receivable in check. You want to make sure that all your credits are cleaned up. You want to make sure that your fee schedule is appropriately set so you're not out of line, so some poor buyer doesn't have to take over the first day and jack up the prices. Those are the basic items that you want to do to kind of get your house in order. And then talk with your CPA and make sure that your P&L is cleaned up and you have one full year of clean books.
We love the third-party evaluation. We love that it separates us from others in the same market space as us. But what it does is it pushes all of the tough conversations to the front. So establishing price and negotiating the price of a practice tends to be, a big hot button for people. It's an emotional sale for both the seller and for the buyer. And this allows us to say, number one, that neither Cameron nor I set the price for the practice. The seller did not set the price for the practice. And it allows the buyer to know that the seller has made an unemotional decision about the price that this is going to go for in terms of, commodity.
And it's not uncommon for a buyer, they're afraid. This is the biggest purchase they've ever made. And they're nervous about cash flow and they don't want to overpay.
Yep.
It's kind of like this whole concept of I got to be aggressive in the negotiation because somebody's trying to take advantage of me. And sellers, they want a fair deal, but they don't want to leave money on the table, and they don't know. And so when we separate this from the emotion, like Jamie said, and have an independent third party who could care less what the outcome is,
Right.
but they're a certified valuator. They just really know what they're doing. And they create this document that just levels the playing field. Nobody feels like they left money on the table, and it takes the most complex, difficult part and just simplifies it and pushes it to the front of the project and makes the outcome so much more favorable for both parties. It's really about time, money, and peace of mind. So it's not rocket science. I mean, a dentist can sell a practice on their own, but they can also redesign and redo their kitchen on their own. And I've tried that, and it didn't go well, But really, the complexity comes in is when we're working with a buyer and you're by yourself, you generally have lost all your leverage. And so now you're going through the process, you're spending money and time with an attorney, and if you don't get across the finish line, you start over. So now you've wasted 3 to 6 months and $5,000 to $10,000 with an attorney, and you're starting over, only to get the same process over and over again because you haven't created any leverage through competition in the market.
I think that both need to take each other's perspective. So seller needs to understand that the buyer needs to be given as much information and transparent information as possible up front. So again, it goes back to the idea of having the third-party valuation, but also having, like Cameron stated earlier, those year full of clean books, if you will, so that all things that the buyer receives are transparent. The seller and the buyer both need to somewhat realize that this is probably a first transaction for both as well. Seller bought a practice, but probably 30 years ago and could have potentially been a much different experience. And so understanding that whether their experience was positive or negative, that they can impact the experience that the buyer is going to have in purchasing their practice. And all of this goes into the goodwill that the buyer is buying. And when they feel like they're on the same team, it makes such a positive transition, much more so than if they felt like they were at odds with each other.
Usually, the way it works is I'll interact with a seller at the time that they're considering putting their practice on the market and having us engage our services with them. Once that starts, Jamie really takes over with the building of the marketing strategy, communicating with the market, with our 9,000 emails, with the newsletter, and then the interaction of communication with our client and the buyers all comes through Jamie's email. So oftentimes clients will think, well, Cameron, it doesn't seem like you do anything, but truth is she is doing all of that communication, so she really is doing that. And then at the end of the process, or whenever we're interacting with a buyer during a showing or negotiations, I re-engage with the client, and then obviously through the closing. But Jamie does all the communication with the associates, all the buyers, interacts, so when they call up, they get Jamie.